Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her helmet as she walked across the tarmac toward her F-16 Fighting Falcon. The morning sun cast long shadows across the airbase, and she could feel the weight of disapproving stares from her fellow pilots. Word had spread quickly through the squadron about yesterday's briefing, where Colonel Hayes had publicly questioned whether the F-16 still belonged in modern air operations. The 28-year-old pilot had been flying F-16s for 6 years, longer than most of the younger pilots who now flew the newer F-35 Lightning jets. She had earned her wings through sheer determination, graduating top of her class from pilot training despite facing skepticism about women in combat roles. Now she faced a different kind of doubt, not about her gender, but about her aircraft. Sarah ran her hand along the sleek nose of her jet, feeling the familiar texture of the composite materials. This particular F-16C had been her assigned aircraft for 2 years. She knew every rivet, every panel, every quirk of its systems. The aircraft had a proven track record, with over 4,500 units built and operated by air forces around the world. Yet somehow, it had become the underdog in an era of stealth technology and advanced avionics. The previous evening, she had stayed late in the hangar, going over maintenance logs and performance data. Her crew chief, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, had found her there past midnight, surrounded by technical manuals and flight records. He understood her frustration better than most. Rodriguez had been working on F-16s for 15 years and had seen them evolve from simple fighters into sophisticated multi-role aircraft. "Captain, you know this bird better than anyone," Rodriguez had told her. "Don't let them convince you she's past her prime. Sometimes experience beats technology." As Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection, she thought about the upcoming joint training exercise. 3 squadrons would participate: her F-16 unit, a squadron of F-35s, and a group of F-22 Raptors. The exercise was designed to test air corridor management and response times during simulated enemy incursions. Intelligence reports suggested that adversary nations were developing new tactics to exploit gaps in air defense coverage. The briefing room had been tense when Colonel Hayes outlined the mission parameters. The F-35 and F-22 pilots had exchanged confident glances, while the F-16 crews seemed uncertain about their role. Hayes had made his position clear. Newer aircraft with advanced sensors and stealth capabilities would take the lead, while F-16s would provide support from secondary positions. "The Fighting Falcon served us well," he had said, "but modern threats require modern solutions. We need to transition our thinking and our resources toward platforms that can survive in contested airspace." Sarah had felt her jaw clench at those words. The F-16 had continuously received upgrades throughout its service life. Her aircraft featured modern radar systems, advanced electronic warfare capabilities, and precision-guided munitions. More importantly, it had something that couldn't be programmed into a computer: the experience and intuition of pilots who had pushed the aircraft to its limits. Climbing into the cockpit, Sarah began her startup procedures with practiced efficiency. The General Electric F-110 engine came to life with a familiar whine, gradually building to a steady roar. She contacted ground control for taxi clearance, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Today's exercise would determine more than just tactical positioning. It would influence future procurement decisions and possibly the fate of her entire squadron. As she taxied toward the runway, Sarah could see the other aircraft preparing for takeoff. The F-35s looked impressive with their angular, stealthy design, while the F-22s appeared almost alien with their diamond-shaped configuration. Her F-16 looked smaller and more conventional by comparison, but she knew that appearances could be deceiving. The tower cleared her for takeoff, and Sarah pushed the throttle forward. The afterburner kicked in with a thunderous roar, pressing her back into her seat as the F-16 accelerated down the runway. Within seconds, she was airborne, climbing rapidly into the clear morning sky. Below her, the airbase grew smaller until it resembled a detailed model. Sarah leveled off at her assigned altitude and checked in with the exercise controller. The mission scenario was beginning to unfold, with simulated enemy aircraft approaching the training area from multiple directions. The F-22s had already moved to their intercept positions, invisible to radar but maintaining radio contact. The F-35s were coordinating their approach, sharing sensor data through their advanced networking systems. Her F-16 had been assigned to a patrol sector that command considered low priority. The assumption was that any serious threats would be handled by the more advanced aircraft before reaching her area. Sarah understood the logic, but something about the tactical picture bothered her. Years of experience had taught her to trust her instincts, even when they contradicted conventional wisdom. As she flew her assigned pattern, Sarah monitored radio communications from the other squadrons. The exercise controllers were introducing complications into the scenario, simulating equipment failures and communication disruptions. She noticed that the F-35 pilots were becoming increasingly reliant on their automated systems, while the F-22s were operating with reduced radar signatures that limited their coordination capabilities. The stage was set for something unexpected, though Sarah didn't yet realize how dramatically the day would unfold. Her F-16 hummed steadily through the sky, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. 30 minutes into the exercise, Sarah noticed something unusual on her radar display. A group of simulated enemy aircraft was approaching from an unexpected direction, using a route that would take them through a gap in the coverage pattern. The F-35s were focused on threats to the north, while the F-22s had moved to intercept what appeared to be the primary attack formation coming from the east. Sarah keyed her radio to report the contact, but static filled her headset. The exercise controllers had introduced an electronic warfare scenario, jamming most communication frequencies to simulate real combat conditions. She tried several backup frequencies, but the interference was too strong. The advanced aircraft relied heavily on data links and networked communications, which were now compromised. Banking her F-16 toward the undetected threat, Sarah relied on skills that had been drilled into her during countless training flights. Unlike the newer aircraft with their automated threat assessment systems, the F-16 required more hands-on flying and decision-making. This had always been considered a disadvantage, but now it proved valuable when electronic systems failed. The enemy formation consisted of 4 aircraft flying in a loose spread formation. According to the exercise rules, they were simulating low observable attack aircraft carrying cruise missiles. Their mission was to penetrate the air defense network and reach designated targets deep in friendly territory. If they succeeded, it would represent a significant failure for the defending forces. Sarah's F-16 was equipped with an older but proven radar system that had been upgraded with modern signal processing capabilities. While it couldn't match the range and resolution of the F-35's AN/APG-81 radar, it was less susceptible to jamming and required fewer supporting systems to operate effectively. She was able to maintain a clear picture of the approaching threats even as the electronic warfare environment intensified. The tactical situation was becoming critical. The simulated enemy aircraft were only minutes away from reaching their launch point, where they could fire cruise missiles at the defended targets. The F-35s and F-22s were still engaged with the decoy formations. Unaware that the real threat was approaching from their blind spot, Sarah realized she was the only pilot in position to intercept the attack. Without functional communications, Sarah couldn't coordinate with the other squadrons or request backup. She would have to engage 4 enemy aircraft alone, using only the weapons carried by her single F-16. The odds were not in her favor, but she had trained for exactly this type of scenario during her years as a Fighting Falcon pilot. Sarah pushed her throttle to military power and climbed to gain altitude advantage over the incoming threats. The F-16's relatively simple design meant she could focus on tactics rather than managing complex systems. She had memorized the aircraft's performance characteristics so thoroughly that flying had become instinctive, allowing her to concentrate on the tactical problem at hand. As she closed the distance to the enemy formation, Sarah began planning her attack. The F-16 carried 4 AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles for beyond visual range engagements and 2 AIM-9X Sidewinders for close-range combat. Against 4 opponents, she would need to use her weapons efficiently and rely on superior tactics to even the odds. The first challenge was achieving a favorable firing position without being detected. The enemy aircraft were maintaining radio silence and flying a profile designed to avoid radar detection. Sarah used the F-16's agility to approach from below and behind, taking advantage of terrain masking and the limited radar coverage of the simulated enemy aircraft. When she reached optimal firing range, Sarah locked onto the trailing enemy aircraft with her first AMRAAM missile. The F-16's fire control system, though older than those on the F-35 and F-22, was still highly effective and had been proven in combat operations around the world. She fired the missile and immediately maneuvered to avoid detection by the remaining 3 aircraft. The exercise controllers confirmed the hit over the emergency frequency, marking 1 enemy aircraft as destroyed. However, Sarah's missile launch had revealed her position, and the remaining 3 enemy aircraft were now aware of her presence. They began evasive maneuvers while continuing toward their target, forcing Sarah to choose between pursuit and allowing them to complete their mission. Sarah's training took over as she analyzed the tactical situation in seconds. The enemy aircraft were spread out enough that she couldn't engage all 3 simultaneously with her remaining long-range missiles. She would need to force them into a position where they would have to choose between their mission and defending themselves against her attack. Banking hard to the right, Sarah used the F-16's superior maneuverability to cut inside the enemy formation's turn. The Fighting Falcon had always been renowned for its agility, and Sarah had pushed her aircraft to its limits during training exercises. She knew exactly how much G-force she could sustain and how tight she could turn without losing control. The enemy pilots were skilled, but they were also constrained by their mission requirements. They couldn't afford to engage in a prolonged dogfight with Sarah's F-16, because it would delay their attack and potentially allow other defending aircraft to arrive. This gave Sarah a psychological advantage despite being outnumbered. As the chase continued, Sarah fired her second AMRAAM at the lead enemy aircraft. The missile tracked successfully, forcing the enemy pilot to break off his attack run to defend against the incoming threat. The exercise controllers called another kill, leaving 2 enemy aircraft still heading toward their target. Sarah was now down to her 2 remaining AMRAAMs and her short-range Sidewinders. The remaining enemy aircraft had reached their cruise missile launch point and were beginning their attack run. Time was running out, and Sarah realized she would need to take a significant risk to prevent the simulated enemy from achieving their objective. Sarah made a split-second decision that would have shocked her instructors back at pilot training. Instead of maintaining a safe distance and trying to pick off the remaining enemy aircraft one by one, she pushed her F-16 into a steep dive, heading directly toward the enemy formation. This aggressive maneuver went against standard doctrine, but Sarah had studied historical air combat encounters and knew that sometimes unconventional tactics could achieve decisive results. The 2 remaining enemy aircraft were now in their final attack phase, preparing to launch simulated cruise missiles at the defended targets. Their pilots were focused on their targeting systems and weapon release procedures, making them temporarily vulnerable to Sarah's unexpected approach. The exercise scenario required them to maintain steady flight paths during the simulated missile launch, limiting their ability to maneuver defensively. Sarah's F-16 screamed through the air at maximum speed, her airframe shuddering slightly as she approached the aircraft's operational limits. She had trained extensively in high-G maneuvers and knew exactly how much stress both she and her aircraft could handle. The Fighting Falcon had been designed as a lightweight fighter with excellent thrust-to-weight ratio, making it capable of sustained high-performance flight. At 2 miles from the enemy formation, Sarah fired her 3rd AMRAAM missile at the closest target. Without waiting to see the result, she immediately launched her 4th and final beyond visual range missile at the remaining aircraft. The rapid-fire engagement left both enemy pilots with minimal time to react, and Sarah used the confusion to close the distance for a gun attack. The exercise controllers confirmed both missile hits, but according to the scenario rules, the enemy aircraft had already released their simulated cruise missiles before being destroyed. The mission appeared to be a failure despite Sarah's aggressive intercept. However, she wasn't finished yet. Sarah had noticed something during her attack run that the exercise controllers might have missed. The simulated cruise missiles had been launched earlier than optimal due to the pressure from her attack. This meant they were following a less efficient flight path that might make them vulnerable to interception by ground-based defense systems. More importantly, Sarah realized that the exercise scenario had a hidden element that none of the other pilots had recognized. The enemy attack was designed to test not just the air-to-air intercept capabilities, but also the defenders' ability to adapt when their primary plan failed. The real test was whether the defending forces could respond creatively to an unexpected situation. Sarah keyed her radio on the emergency frequency, finally able to break through the electronic jamming with a short-range transmission. Control, this is Viper 6. Enemy cruise missiles launched from Sector 7 heading 270. Recommend immediate notification to ground defense units. The exercise controller's voice crackled back through the static. Viper 6, confirm enemy missile launch parameters and your current position. Control, 4 enemy cruise missiles, low altitude, estimated time to target 12 minutes. I'm in pursuit but need backup to establish intercept corridor. Sarah was flying on pure instinct now, her years of experience guiding her through the complex tactical situation. What Sarah had realized, and what the advanced F-35 and F-22 pilots had missed, was that the exercise was testing integrated air defense rather than just individual aircraft performance. The F-16's simpler systems and her extensive training in basic air combat maneuvering had allowed her to maintain situational awareness even when electronic warfare disrupted the more sophisticated aircraft. Sarah's F-16 was now alone in the contested airspace, chasing 4 simulated cruise missiles that were flying at low altitude toward their targets. Her aircraft was running low on fuel, and she had expended all of her long-range missiles. The conventional response would be to return to base and allow ground-based systems to handle the cruise missile threat. Instead, Sarah made another unconventional decision. She contacted the Ground Defense Coordination Center directly, using her position and radar data to help guide surface-to-air missile systems toward the incoming threats. The F-16's relatively simple avionics actually made it easier to share targeting information with ground-based systems that used similar technology. Patriot Control, this is Viper 6. I have 4 low-flying contacts bearing 270 at 60 miles from target area. Can you accept handoff for intercept? Sarah's voice was calm despite the intensity of the situation. The ground controller responded immediately. Viper 6, we have you on scope. Confirm contact bearing and altitude. Sarah began providing real-time targeting updates to the surface-to-air missile battery, using her F-16's radar to track the cruise missiles as they maneuvered through the low-altitude corridor. This type of coordination required precise communication and timing, skills that had been emphasized during her F-16 training but were less practiced by pilots of more autonomous aircraft. The Patriot missile system successfully intercepted 3 of the 4 simulated cruise missiles, but the 4th had taken an evasive route that put it outside the ground system's engagement envelope. Sarah realized she was the only remaining asset in position to stop the final missile from reaching its target. Her F-16 was now critically low on fuel, and regulations required her to return to base immediately. However, Sarah calculated that she had just enough fuel for one more intercept attempt if she was willing to accept the risk of having to make an emergency landing. The decision could end her career if she violated safety protocols, but it could also save the exercise from complete failure. Sarah pushed her throttle forward once more, pointing her F-16's nose toward the final cruise missile. She had one weapon remaining, the M61A1 Vulcan cannon built into her aircraft. The 6-barreled Gatling gun carried 501 rounds of 20mm ammunition and had been the F-16's built-in weapon since the aircraft's first flight. It was simple, reliable, and devastatingly effective at close range. The final cruise missile was flying barely 50 feet above the ground, using terrain-following radar to avoid detection by ground-based systems. Sarah had to descend to an extremely low altitude to intercept it, flying her F-16 through a narrow valley that tested every skill she had learned during her years as a pilot. The mountains on either side provided natural cover, but also created dangerous wind conditions that could slam her aircraft into the rocky walls. Sarah's fuel gauge showed critically low levels. With warning lights flashing on her instrument panel, she had perhaps 2 minutes of flight time remaining before she would be forced to eject or attempt an emergency landing. The smart decision would be to climb to a safe altitude and head for the nearest airfield. But Sarah was determined to complete the intercept. The cruise missile was following a predetermined course toward a simulated command center located in a valley 30 miles ahead. If it reached its target, the exercise would be considered a partial failure for the defending forces. More importantly for Sarah, it would reinforce Colonel Hayes's argument that F-16s were no longer capable of handling modern threats. Sarah's radar had difficulty maintaining a lock on the low-flying missile due to ground clutter and interference from the surrounding terrain. She switched to visual acquisition, using her eyes and experience to track the small, fast-moving target. This was exactly the type of situation where pilot skill and aircraft agility mattered more than advanced sensors and automated systems. The F-16's heads-up display projected critical flight information onto Sarah's visor, allowing her to keep her eyes focused outside the cockpit while monitoring airspeed, altitude, and weapon status. She had practiced low-level intercepts hundreds of times during training, but never with such challenging terrain and fuel constraints. As Sarah closed the distance to the cruise missile, she realized that a conventional gun attack would be extremely difficult due to the missile's small size and erratic flight path. The weapon was designed to be difficult to intercept, using random course corrections to avoid defensive fire. Sarah would need to anticipate its movements and fire ahead of its projected position. The F-16's gun sight calculated the proper lead angle automatically, but Sarah knew that the computer's predictions might not account for the missile's evasive programming. She would have to rely on her instincts and experience to time the shot correctly. With only 511 rounds available, she couldn't afford to waste ammunition on poorly aimed bursts. Sarah maneuvered her F-16 into position behind and slightly above the cruise missile, matching its speed and altitude while staying clear of its exhaust plume. The missile was traveling at approximately 550 miles per hour, requiring precise flying to maintain formation. One wrong move could send her F-16 tumbling into the ground or crashing into the mountainous terrain. At 800 yards range, Sarah opened fire with her cannon. The M61A1 Vulcan gun unleashed a stream of 20mm rounds at a rate of 6,000 rounds per minute, creating a deadly cone of metal that filled the air ahead of the cruise missile. The tracers allowed Sarah to see exactly where her rounds were going, enabling her to adjust her aim in real time. The first burst missed as the cruise missile executed a programmed turn to the left. Sarah corrected her aim and fired again, this time leading the target by a greater margin. She could see her tracers passing just behind the missile as it continued its evasive maneuvers. With each burst, her ammunition count decreased rapidly, and her fuel situation became more critical. On her third burst, Sarah saw sparks fly from the cruise missile's tail section. She had scored hits, but the weapon continued flying toward its target. The missile was designed to survive light damage and complete its mission even if partially disabled. Sarah would need to achieve more substantial damage to stop it completely. Sarah's fuel warning alarm began chiming continuously, indicating that she had less than 1 minute of flight time remaining. She was now committed to the intercept attempt, as she no longer had enough fuel to reach a safe landing site. Her only option was to stop the missile and then attempt an emergency landing in the valley below. Closing to 400 yards, Sarah fired a longer burst, walking her tracers across the missile's flight path. This time she saw multiple hits along the weapon's fuselage, and the missile began to wobble slightly. However, it was still flying and remained on course toward its target. Sarah realized she would need to get even closer for a decisive shot. At 200 yards, Sarah was flying directly behind the cruise missile, so close that debris from her cannon rounds was bouncing off her F-16's windscreen. The missile's exhaust was creating turbulence that made precise aiming difficult, but Sarah had no choice but to press the attack. She fired her longest burst yet, emptying nearly half of her remaining ammunition into the target. The cruise missile suddenly pitched upward and began tumbling out of control. Sarah had severed critical control cables with her cannon fire, causing the weapon to lose guidance and stability. She watched as it crashed into the mountainside below, creating a large explosion that marked the end of the simulated attack. "Control, this is Viper 6, Sarah transmitted on the emergency frequency. "Final cruise missile destroyed. I am declaring a fuel emergency and will attempt landing at the nearest suitable site." The exercise controller's voice came back immediately. "Viper 6, understand fuel emergency. Vector to runway 18 at Mountain View Auxiliary Field. Distance 12 miles, bearing 090. Sarah turned toward the emergency landing site, her engine beginning to sputter as the last drops of fuel fed through the system. She had accomplished something that many would have thought impossible. A single F-16 had successfully defended against a coordinated cruise missile attack that had overwhelmed more advanced aircraft systems. Sarah's F-16 glided silently through the mountain air, its engine having flamed out completely as the last fuel was consumed. The aircraft had transformed from a powerful fighter jet into an expensive glider, and Sarah now faced the challenge of bringing it down safely without power. Emergency landings were something every pilot trained for, but few ever experienced in real life. The Mountain View Auxiliary Airfield appeared ahead, a narrow strip of concrete carved into the valley floor. It had been built during World War II as an emergency landing site, and was barely long enough for modern military aircraft. Sarah would have only one chance to get the approach right, as she had no power to execute a go-around if something went wrong. Sarah lowered her landing gear manually using the emergency extension system, feeling the drag increase as the wheels locked into position. Without engine power, she had to manage her altitude and airspeed carefully, trading height for speed and using the F-16's natural gliding characteristics to maintain control. The aircraft was still highly maneuverable even without thrust, a testament to its excellent aerodynamic design. Mountain View Tower, this is Air Force Viper 6, declaring emergency. Single F-16 flameout straight-in approach to runway 18. Request crash and rescue equipment standing by. Sarah's voice remained calm and professional despite the stress of the situation. Viper 6, Mountain View Tower. Runway 18 cleared for emergency landing. Crash trucks are rolling. Wind is calm, visibility unlimited. You are cleared to land. As Sarah lined up with the runway, she could see emergency vehicles racing toward their positions along the flight path. The auxiliary field's fire department was small but well-trained, having dealt with emergency landings before. She felt a moment of gratitude for the countless support personnel who made military aviation possible. The approach required perfect energy management. Sarah had to arrive at the runway threshold with exactly the right combination of altitude and airspeed. Too high or too fast and she would overshoot the short runway. Too low or too slow and she would crash short of the pavement. There was no margin for error. Sarah extended her F-16's air brakes and adjusted her glide path, using the aircraft's flight controls to fine-tune her descent. The Fighting Falcon responded precisely to her inputs, its flight control system still functioning normally despite the engine failure. She had always appreciated the F-16's honest flying characteristics, and now they were potentially saving her life. The runway grew larger in her windscreen as Sarah descended through 500 feet, then 300, then 100. She could see the crash trucks positioned along the runway and emergency personnel standing ready to respond. The landing would be harder than normal without thrust reversers to help slow the aircraft, but the F-16's robust landing gear was designed to handle high-impact touchdowns. Sarah flared her F-16 just above the runway, pulling the nose up slightly to reduce her descent rate. The main landing gear touched down with a firm thump, and she immediately applied maximum wheel brakes while deploying the drag chute. The parachute streamed out behind the aircraft, creating additional drag to help slow her rolling speed. The F-16 rolled down the short runway, gradually slowing as the brakes and drag chute did their work. Sarah could feel the aircraft decelerating, but she was still moving fast as she approached the far end of the pavement. For a moment it seemed like she might not be able to stop in time, but the drag chute caught more air and helped bring the Fighter Falcon to a halt, just 200 feet from the runway's end. Viper 6. Good landing, came the voice from the tower. Remain in your aircraft until crash personnel complete their inspection. Sarah sat in her cockpit as emergency crews surrounded her F-16, checking for fuel leaks, hot brakes, or other hazards. Her hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline, but she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not only had she successfully completed an incredibly challenging intercept mission, but she had also demonstrated the skills and judgment that made experienced pilots valuable, regardless of what aircraft they flew. Within minutes, the emergency crews gave the all-clear signal, and Sarah shut down her aircraft systems before climbing out of the cockpit. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was among the first people to reach her, having driven from the main base as soon as he heard about the emergency landing. His weathered face showed both relief and pride as he helped her down from the aircraft. "How's she look, Sergeant?" Sarah asked, referring to her F-16. Rodriguez walked around the aircraft, examining the airframe and landing gear with an expert eye. "She looks good, Captain. No apparent damage from the landing. We'll need to inspect the gun system and refuel her, but I think she's ready to fly home once we get some maintenance time." Sarah looked back at her F-16 sitting on the remote runway, surrounded by emergency vehicles and support personnel. The aircraft had performed flawlessly during the most challenging mission of her career, proving that experience and skill could overcome technological disadvantage. She thought about Colonel Hayes and his comments about obsolete aircraft, wondering if the day's events might change his perspective. The exercise controller's voice crackled over a portable radio carried by one of the emergency crew members. "All aircraft, this is Control." Exercise terminated. All units returned to base for immediate debrief. Special recognition for outstanding performance by Viper 6. Sarah felt a surge of pride at the controller's words, but she knew the real test would come during the debrief session. She would have to explain her decisions and justify her aggressive tactics to a room full of senior officers, including Colonel Hayes. The success of her mission was clear, but military culture valued following procedures as much as achieving results. As she waited for transportation back to the main base, Sarah reflected on the day's events. Her F-16 had faced off against simulated threats that were designed to challenge the most advanced aircraft in the inventory. Through a combination of pilot skill, aircraft reliability, and tactical innovation, she had achieved a level of success that surprised even herself. The real question now was whether her performance would influence the ongoing debates about future aircraft procurement and force structure. Sarah hoped that decision-makers would recognize the value of maintaining a diverse fleet that included both advanced technology and proven platforms operated by experienced crews. The debrief room at the main airbase was packed with pilots, controllers, and senior officers from all three squadrons. Colonel Hayes sat at the front of the room with the exercise evaluation team, studying data displays that showed the complete timeline of the morning's activities. Sarah entered wearing a borrowed flight suit, still feeling the effects of adrenaline from her emergency landing 2 hours earlier. The atmosphere in the room was tense with anticipation. Word had spread quickly about Sarah's single-handed intercept of the cruise missile attack, and many pilots were eager to understand exactly what had happened. The F-35 and F-22 pilots looked particularly subdued, knowing that their advanced aircraft had been outperformed by what many considered an obsolete platform. Colonel Hayes called the room to attention and began the formal debrief process. Large screens displayed the exercise timeline, showing aircraft positions, communications, and engagement results. The tactical picture revealed just how close the simulated enemy attack had come to complete success, and how Sarah's individual actions had prevented a training disaster. Today's exercise was designed to test our ability to defend against coordinated attacks using modern threat profiles, Hayes began. The results demonstrate both strengths and weaknesses in our current force structure and procedures. The colonel clicked through slides showing the initial phase of the exercise, where F-35 and F-22 aircraft had successfully engaged the primary threat formations. Their performance had been textbook perfect, with advanced sensors and networking capabilities enabling coordinated intercepts that eliminated multiple targets efficiently. However, the slides also revealed the critical gap that had allowed the secondary attack to proceed undetected. The advanced aircraft had become focused on their assigned sectors, relying on automated threat assessment systems that had missed the unconventional approach route used by the cruise missile carriers. "Captain Mitchell," Hayes said, turning toward Sarah. "Please walk us through your decision-making process during the engagement." Sarah stood and moved to the front of the room, acutely aware that every eye was focused on her. She had rehearsed this moment during the flight back from Mountain View, knowing that her explanations would need to be clear and professional. "Sir, I initially observed the secondary threat formation while conducting my assigned patrol. When standard communications were jammed, I made the decision to intercept independently rather than attempt to re-establish contact with other units." Sarah used a laser pointer to trace her flight path on the tactical display, showing how she had maneuvered to engage 4 enemy aircraft with limited weapons and no backup. Several pilots in the audience shifted uncomfortably as they realized the odds she had faced. The key factor was maintaining situational awareness when electronic systems were compromised, Sarah continued. The F-16's simpler avionics actually provided an advantage in this environment, allowing me to focus on basic air-to-air tactics rather than managing complex automated systems. A major from the F-35 squadron raised his hand. "Captain, weren't you concerned about violating engagement procedures by attacking without proper coordination?" Sarah had expected this question and had prepared her response carefully. "Sir, the electronic warfare environment made standard coordination impossible. I assessed that the threat to defended assets outweighed the risks of independent action. The F-16's design philosophy emphasizes pilot decision-making in exactly these types of situations. Colonel Hayes studied the tactical display for several seconds before speaking. Captain Mitchell, your fuel management during the final intercept was extremely aggressive. Some might say reckless. How do you justify that decision? This was the moment Sarah had been dreading. Her fuel calculations had been borderline, and any number of factors could have resulted in a catastrophic outcome. She chose to answer with complete honesty. Sir, I calculated that I had sufficient fuel for one intercept attempt if executed efficiently. The alternative was allowing the final cruise missile to reach its target, which would have constituted mission failure. I believed the risk was acceptable given the tactical situation. The room was silent as officers absorbed Sarah's explanation. The Deputy Wing Commander, Brigadier General Thompson, spoke from the back of the room. Captain, in your opinion, what factors enabled your success against a numerically superior force? Sarah had been thinking about this question since her emergency landing. Ma'am, I believe 3 factors were critical. First, the F-16's agility allowed me to maneuver aggressively in close combat situations. Second, my experience with the aircraft systems enabled efficient operation when advanced automation was unavailable. Third, the simplicity of F-16 operations allowed me to focus on tactics rather than technology management. General Thompson nodded thoughtfully. And how do you assess the performance of the more advanced aircraft during this exercise? Sarah chose her words carefully, aware that she was speaking about her fellow pilot's aircraft. Ma'am, the F-35 and F-22 aircraft performed exactly as designed within their operational parameters. However, their reliance on networked systems and automated decision-making may have created vulnerabilities in a degraded communications environment. Colonel Hayes leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Captain Mitchell, are you suggesting that older aircraft designs are superior to modern platforms? No, sir, Sarah replied immediately. I'm suggesting that different aircraft designs offer different advantages depending on the tactical situation. The F-16's human-centered design philosophy emphasizes pilot skills and decision-making, which proved valuable today. However, I recognize that F-35 and F-22 aircraft offer capabilities that the F-16 cannot match in other scenarios. The exercise evaluation officer stood to present the formal assessment results. Based on today's exercise, defending forces successfully intercepted 85% of simulated threats. The cruise missile attack was completely neutralized, preventing any simulated damage to defended assets. Captain Mitchell's individual performance was rated as exceptional, demonstrating innovative tactics and superior airmanship. Murmurs of approval rippled through the room as pilots from all squadrons acknowledged Sarah's achievement. Even the F-35 and F-22 pilots seemed genuinely impressed by her performance, recognizing the skill required to succeed against such overwhelming odds. Colonel Hayes stood and addressed the room. Today's exercise has provided valuable lessons about the importance of tactical flexibility in pilot training. While advanced technology remains essential for modern air operations, we must not forget the fundamental skills that enable pilots to succeed when technology fails. The colonel's words carried weight throughout the room, signaling a potential shift in his thinking about aircraft modernization and pilot training priorities. 3 weeks after the exercise, Sarah found herself in an unexpected situation. Instead of facing criticism for her aggressive tactics, she had been selected to brief senior Pentagon officials about the lessons learned from the training mission. The success of her F-16 against simulated advanced threats had caught the attention of defense planners who were wrestling with budget decisions and force structure planning. The briefing room in the Pentagon was filled with colonels, generals, and civilian defense officials responsible for aircraft procurement and operational planning. Sarah had spent days preparing her presentation, working with intelligence analysts and test pilots to document the tactical implications of the exercise results. Ladies and gentlemen, General Thompson began, Captain Mitchell will present findings from Exercise Swift Defender that have significant implications for our future air combat capabilities. Sarah activated the first slide of her presentation, showing a comparison of F-16, F-35, and F-22 performance during the exercise. The data revealed that while advanced aircraft excelled in certain scenarios, they had vulnerabilities that could be exploited by innovative tactics and experienced pilots. The exercise demonstrated that aircraft effectiveness depends heavily on the tactical environment and mission requirements, Sarah explained. Advanced stealth and sensor capabilities provide decisive advantages in permissive environments, but may become liabilities when supporting systems are compromised. A Navy admiral interrupted her presentation. "Captain, are you suggesting that we should reconsider our investment in fifth-generation aircraft?" "No, sir," Sarah replied firmly. "I'm suggesting that we need a balanced force structure that includes both advanced platforms and proven aircraft operated by highly trained pilots." The F-16's performance during the exercise was enabled by decades of pilot experience and continuous aircraft improvements. Sarah clicked to her next slide, showing how the F-16's upgrade path had kept pace with evolving threats. Modern F-16s carried advanced radar systems, precision weapons, and electronic warfare capabilities that rivaled those found on much newer aircraft. The key difference was the aircraft's design philosophy, which emphasized pilot control over automated systems. A civilian analyst from the Office of the Secretary of Defense asked about cost implications. "Captain, how do maintenance and operational costs compare between the F-16 and newer platforms?" Sarah had anticipated this question and had worked with logistics specialists to prepare accurate data. "Sir, F-16 operating costs are approximately 60% lower than F-35 costs and 70% lower than F-22 costs. Additionally, F-16 maintenance can be performed by smaller support teams using less specialized equipment, improving operational flexibility." The briefing continued for over an hour as Sarah fielded questions about pilot training, aircraft capabilities, and tactical implications. She emphasized that her success during the exercise was not just about the F-16's design, but about the combination of aircraft characteristics and pilot skills developed over years of experience. Colonel Hayes, who had flown to Washington for the briefing, stood to address the room. "I want to emphasize that Captain Mitchell's performance reflects the highest standards of military aviation. Her success has caused me to reconsider some of my previous assumptions about aircraft modernization priorities." Sarah was surprised by Hayes's public acknowledgement, knowing how difficult it must have been for him to admit that his initial assessment had been incomplete. His change of perspective carried significant weight in the room, as other officers recognized his reputation for careful analysis and strategic thinking. The Deputy Secretary of Defense closed the briefing with remarks about the importance of maintaining diverse capabilities. "Today's presentation reinforces the need for balanced procurement decisions that consider both technological advancement and operational experience. We must ensure that our pursuit of advanced capabilities doesn't compromise the fundamental skills that enable success in combat." Following the Pentagon briefing, Sarah received orders to participate in a comprehensive review of pilot training programs and aircraft modernization plans. Her experience during Exercise Swift Defender had demonstrated the value of maintaining older aircraft types alongside newer platforms, leading to policy changes that would affect the entire Air Force. The review process took several months and involved collaboration with test pilots, combat veterans, and defense contractors. Sarah found herself working with teams developing new training programs that emphasized basic air combat skills, alongside advanced systems management. The goal was ensuring that pilots could perform effectively, regardless of what aircraft they flew or what electronic environment they encountered. 6 months after the exercise, Sarah received notification of her promotion to major, along with assignment as the commander of a new squadron combining F-16 and F-35 aircraft. The mixed unit would serve as a testbed for integrated operations between different aircraft types, exploring how various platforms could complement each other in complex scenarios. On her final day as captain, Sarah visited her old F-16 in the hangar, where Master Sergeant Rodriguez was performing routine maintenance. The aircraft had been upgraded with new avionics and weapon systems, ensuring it would remain relevant for years to come. "She's ready for whatever comes next, Major," Rodriguez said with a smile. "This old bird has proven she's still got fight left in her." Sarah ran her hand along the F-16's nose, remembering the day when everyone had considered it obsolete. The aircraft had not only proven its continued value, but had also reminded the military community that technology alone could not replace the importance of pilot skill and tactical innovation. The story of Exercise Swift Defender had spread throughout the military aviation community, becoming a case study taught at pilot training schools and war colleges. Sarah's aggressive low-pass intercept had not only shifted the air corridor that day, but had also shifted strategic thinking about aircraft procurement and pilot development for years to come. As Sarah looked at her F-16 one last time before taking command of her new squadron, she reflected on how a single training mission had changed her career and influenced national defense policy. The Fighting Falcon had earned its name through decades of service, and thanks to one memorable day, it would continue fighting for many more years.